thank you for coming to learn more about education law and sort of sharing what your interest in education law is. I'm going to give you a sense of the classes that are offered at UVA that are in the core education law classes, and then I'll give you the ones that are adjacent to that, and then I'll take questions and sort of give you a sense. Before I do that, I just want to introduce myself to you. So I am the professor who focuses on education law and policy at UVA, but there are several who also teach education law classes. So my work has really focused on, when I started out in law school, I was very interested in becoming a civil rights attorney, particularly a litigator. And because of that, I started investigating, like, why do we have the inequalities and disparities that we have in education? And one of the reasons that we have that is because we have a very broken education system in many ways. So we don't give many children a high quality education. That could be children with special needs, that could be children in poverty, that could be children in urban environments. There's just a variety of ways in which we often shortchange kids. And so because of that, I started in my civil rights work, like, it kept all pointing back to education. It was like the criminal justice system, if you look at the average education for people in prison, it tends to be significantly below average. If you look at housing policy, it's very impactful on education law and policy, and vice versa. Healthcare outcomes are influenced by your education. It all sort of just pointed back to education. So I was like, clearly this is the epicenter of civil rights. So I started focusing on education law and policy. And then I went off to, after I clerked for a year, which I highly recommend, just put in your calendar now, if you're clerking after law school, whether you do a year and then clerk or you go straight to a clerkship. Wonderful, amazing experience in San Francisco working on the Ninth Circuit for a federal judge there. And so wonderful experience there, and then went off to a law firm called Hogan Lovells. So Hogan Lovells is a large firm in DC. I was someone who had to take loans to attend Harvard Law School. And so because of that, I needed to go to a law firm after school, even though I wanted to be a public interest attorney ultimately. And what I was very fortunate to find and was a law firm that was doing work that was very supportive of issues of equal education opportunity, was supportive of civil rights, and where I could practice and still feel like I was being consistent with the values that I had and that I was interested in. So I started out at Hogan Lovells. It actually used to be called Hogan Hartson, but now it's Hogan Lovells. And then I went off to the U.S. Department of Education, which was, I spent 5 years there. I worked in the Clinton administration, and then I worked in the Bush administration. So worked on civil rights the entire time, but also got to see what it was like to work under two different administrations on the same issues. They definitely had some differences, although far fewer differences than we seem to have today. Like there were fewer differences then. But amazing, wonderful work, but I was asking questions about why is the education system so broken, and why are we giving, poor kids, many children of color, really inferior educational opportunities? Like, how did we get to a system in the United States, with its great wealth and great opportunities and the American dream that says we can all achieve? Like, why are we shortchanging so many kids? And so asking those kind of big questions are what scholars do, right? We think about like systems and sort of how they should be reformed and why are they the way they are. We interrogate systems and we help to, sort of propose solutions. The other thing I will tell you about all of my classes is that in education law and policy, I'm very concerned with not only what education law is, but what it should be. So I want you all to think about how should education law be better. Most of you told me something about why you're concerned about education, what's broken, what's not working, children whose needs aren't getting met. And so what we spend time talking in class about, and I ask about it on the exam, is, okay, so here's a law, tell me what it, critique it, but also how could it be better? And that is much harder than saying what's wrong with it. You can often identify what's wrong, but to come up with the right standard, and then as soon as you write it, you're thinking, oh, this would result in this challenge or that challenge. So we work through multiple examples of that in class. I do quite a bit of like breaking students into groups, giving you problems to work on, presentations, things like that, so that you have a sense of like how to problem solve, of not only breaking something down in a law or a policy, but how to make it better and how to think about all of the research that undergirds the law and how the law could better reflect the best research on the issue. So that is something I focus on a lot. So what do the classes look like that I offer and others offer at the law school? So I brought some of my course materials because I thought it might be helpful for you. So, and I'm going to give you a bit of sequencing to help you in case you ultimately do join us here at UVA, which I hope all of you do. So the class I recommend for 1Ls that are interested in education law is Education Law Survey. And as you might imagine, that is an overview of a lot of topics. And that's why I recommend it for 1Ls who are interested in education law, because it introduces you to quite a bit in education law policy. We cover everything from school desegregation to school funding. We talk about school choice. We talk about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We hit Title IX. We hit freedom of expression. So we talk about vouchers. Like, we just cover a wide range of topics. And so because of that, it's a good way to introduce yourself to education law policy. I find that I offer it in the spring, and since you 1Ls have 2 electives in the spring, I tend to get a significant number of 1Ls who take the class and tend to have a shared interest in education law and sort of take it together. So I find that that is true for education law and policy. The other classes that I do offer a 1-week class on Title IX. So I look at topics of sex discrimination and sexual identity, discrimination in Title IX. We look at athletics, we look at sexual harassment, we look at LGBTQI students, and we look at how law and policy applies to them, how it's started, how it's changed, how it could be improved. And students write a short paper for that 1 credit class. So that is in January. I teach that with a litigator from the Department of Justice. She's the deputy chief at the Department of Justice in the Educational Opportunities section. And so we get a chance to meet someone who is actually practicing in the federal government in this issue now, on these issues right now. She's amazing, and we just taught this class together for the first time, and we were like, let's do it again. So that's going to be a regular addition to the curriculum. I also teach 2 other classes. One is a class that I created from scratch, and that is called Race, Education, and Opportunity. And so I created, there's not a case book because I put all the course materials together, which is why you're seeing these types of things. So I created this course to look at issues of race related to education because they're very salient in education. They influence school funding, they influence school desegregation, historically Black colleges and universities. Now I started the first day discussing the anti-CRT laws that are coming out for schools. We talk about the affirmative action cases, the school to prison pipeline. We cover sort of the array of issues that are even getting more attention now since the summer of 2020 and George Floyd. I feel like people are much more open to realizing that we have a lot of systemic inequality in education and sort of need to do better about dismantling that history of education discrimination so that we can give all kids a high quality education. So we talk about those issues in race, education, opportunity. And then the other class I offer is a class that's a seminar. And for that, there is not an exam. You write a paper. You probably already know that you have to write a paper, 3rd-year paper. Many students write in their 2nd year, but it's they call it an upper level writing requirement. And what you do for that is you write a paper, I think it's at least 7,500 words, and you pick a class to write that for, or you can do an independent study. But I teach a class that satisfies the upper level writing requirement. The last 4 classes are students presenting their research and papers. So the course materials for that are these 2 books. It's not a coincidence that my name is on the front of them. We talk about, it focuses on the case of San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez and the impact of that decision that held that there is not a federal right to education. And then from there, sort of what happened when the issue was no longer able to go into federal court, how have the states dealt with the issue? And so this book looks at that. And then my other book both are edited volumes. So they sort of lend themselves perfectly to courses because you get a whole bunch of voices. It's not just one person's voice. I have scholars from all over the country, top the leading scholars in education, talking about should we recognize a right to education. So there's a chapter that says we should not recognize a federal right to education. There's a chapter that says, a couple that say we should. And then I look in the second part at what would that right contain and how should we recognize it. So those are the books that we use for the seminar. But the great thing about that class is it changes every year because students pick their topics and they get to present to the class on what they do. So I always get students who write about special education. I almost always get a school funding paper. There's just some topics that recur. And then there's others that are unusual. So for example, I had an amazing paper once about the federal school lunch program and like how that's administered, how it's effective, how the nutritional value of the program, all of that. So that is a way that students get to present. The other thing that I do in my courses where students get to present is I do something called a discussion spark. And a discussion spark lets a student pick an article, like a news article or a short video. They get to send it to the class, and at the last 10 to 15 minutes of class, we'll discuss it. So it relates to the topic of the class usually, and it gives you all a chance to sort of bring in something you're thinking about or that you want to talk about that you might not feel is covered in the way that you want it to be covered in the syllabus. And so it sort of lets you guys step in and sort of you take the podium and you direct the discussion and you share questions with your colleagues and sort of debate the issues that you want to talk about. And you present them the information that you want them to read. So that's another way that my students get to sort of own the course content that we're doing. And I started that actually when we were teaching on Zoom, because you're on Zoom and after you hit that 60-minute mark, you're slowly starting to fade a little bit. And so I found that injecting a student presenting, like me no longer presenting, a student taking over, them presenting and asking questions, really got everybody back in. It was oh, we're doing something different now. One of my classmates is presenting, and oh, by the way, I will be presenting at some point, so I need to participate when my classmate's presenting. So that really got students to come back into the conversation a lot and really engage in what's happening. So obviously it's not on Zoom anymore, but I've kept that because I find that students really love getting to pick what they want everyone to talk about, and so that works out really well. So before I jump into education law, the other education law classes, or adjacent classes, I'm going to tell you about two more classes. So one is there is a higher education law class that's taught at UVA. It's being offered currently this spring. So that's taught by Kelly Hodges. And then my husband, Gerard Robinson, teaches education inside U.S. prisons, and he uses both this book and as well as some materials that he puts on Canvas. He has been a state education chief for 2 different governors, and he teaches about, he starts all the way with what is the reason for punishment? Why do we have punishment? Is it, or why do we have, prisons? Is it to rehabilitate or is it to punish? And he looks at sort of the origins of that all the way up through current programs, which now are allowed to provide a Pell Grant to students to individuals in prison so that they can get higher education. So he uses this book in part, but he also uses other course materials. And that class has become increasingly popular among students, particularly because I think students who are going into criminal justice work are very interested in sort of, okay, don't just want to help this person in their trial. I want to make sure this person succeeds. And much of what you see in the research is that individuals who are incarcerated tend to have a lower education level than the average individual living in the United States. And so there's very robust issues around how should we address the need for the fact that many individuals in prison will return to our society and our communities. How do we want them educated while they're in prison so that they succeed when they leave? So those are the education focus classes. I'm going to shift to the adjacent classes, but first I want to answer any questions that you all have before I make that shift. All right, so no questions? Great, all right, I'll do the adjacent classes then. And then, let's see where we are in time. I'm sure that we will have time for questions. We might have some time. Okay, so Other classes you want to think about if you're thinking about a career in education law, which a career in education law could be working for a law firm, it could be working for the federal government, state government, you can work for a nonprofit like Communities in Schools, Teach for America, all of these places, Education Trust, they all have attorneys working there. So you could go work on Capitol Hill, you could work in your state, in a state legislature, you could become a state lawmaker or a judge, state judge, federal judge. Any of those things might involve education law. So what else might you want to think about? There are some clinics that are available that you could really get some hands-on work in education. So there's a juvenile justice clinic taught by Crystal Shin, who's an excellent, has like a long range of experience and excellent attorney in addressing issues of juvenile justice. She works with students who will help individuals in K-12 schools who've been charged with a crime, and then she will assist them with helping in their defense, so that's one option. Another one that's very popular among my students is a clinic on state and local government law with Andy Block. So he recently served in Governor Northam's administration, working on issues related to, I believe it's juvenile justice, I have to check that. But he teaches a state and local government class. In education law, the action is significantly at the state and local level. And so because of that, he often engages in issues related to education law. I've had many of my students take his courses and rave about how wonderful he is, particularly because he's got a lot of hands-on experience having worked in state government. So there's that. And then other possibilities, you want to think about sort of foundational courses that relate to education law if you're interested in a career in that. That would be things like several of you mentioned when you talked about what you're interested in studying. Poverty law, that's an issue that has big impacts on issues of K-12 education and higher education. Housing law, scholars in education law and housing law often say housing policy is school policy and school policy is housing policy. Close nexus between the two, so understanding housing law is really important. Another one to think about is employment law. That deals with issues of like labor unions, teacher contracts, other of those issues. Lots of employment issues in education law and policy, so you may want to think about studying those issues. There's also Professor Schrager teaches a class on state and local government law. So there's the clinic by Andy Block, and then there's a course, and you could do either or both. They're not exclusive to one another. Other classes. Kim for Missouri teaches a class on race and the law. So that is going to look at race across a variety of domains. So my course goes deep into race in education, but his goes across criminal justice, voting. All of voting especially is a big influence on education law and policy. And so if you particularly want to study the intersection of education and race, understanding how we're dealing with other racial issues in the United States, it can be really helpful and important. And then the last thing I will share, and then I'll just have it focus on your questions, are that you want to think about some foundational courses that will help you practice education law policy. One of those most important that I would recommend is either administrative law or legislation and regulation. And that is because much of education law is found in regulations and guidance. It is not all in a statute, whether at the state level or the federal level. Some of it's in regulations that are binding, some of it's in guidance, which is not binding, but all of which helps your clients understand what their obligations are. So you really do want to understand like how administrative law works. Legislation and regulation also helps with statutory interpretation. So that's a kind of, legislation and regulation is a class that has an administrative law component and a statutory interpretation component. So it sort of blends the two together. So that I highly recommend for education law because there's just a web of regulations that govern what clients are doing in education law. Another one set of courses I would recommend are at least like one related to either negotiation or litigation, because there's quite a bit of education law is determined through litigation. The negotiation course is a wonderful course taught by Molly Shadle. She does courses that are focused on negotiation. They are highly sought after. You need to prioritize them high on your list to get in because they're capped. She does a lot of exercises, and so they're small classes. But she's an excellent teacher and does also a great course where she tapes a course and it's like put online and people around the country and the world watch it. So she's very, very good. So she's in hot demand here at UVA. So that's another course to think about. I know I took a negotiation course in law school, and it was definitely one of the most useful courses. I feel like that's one of the classes I've used the most, just constantly negotiating things in life, whether it's, it could be about a car sale or it could be something else. Like, it's just really helpful to know what works in negotiation and what doesn't. It's just a great life skill. But it's also typically important for the practice of law. So you want to think about those sort of broad classes as well as sort of the adjacent classes to education law and policy. So I've been talking a lot. I'm happy to take your questions and what would interest you in terms of, or what questions you have about what I just covered.